Nevada Board of Wildlife Commissioners meeting here in Elko with video conference feeds to Reno and Las Vegas. Before the break, we were in the middle of item 21, which is Commission Regulation 16-13, and it's the 2016 and 2017 and 17-18 upland game and fur bear seasons and bag limits. If you'll recall, before the break, we finished the upland game portion of this, so the second portion on fur bears will be presented by Russell Wolstenhume, Wildlife Staff Specialist. This is for possible action. The Commission will establish regulations for seasons for fur bearers for the 2016-17 and 17-18 seasons. Mr. Wolstenhume, good afternoon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the Commission. Russell Wolstenhume, Nevada Department of Wildlife, for the record. I'd like to start off by just stating that restating the NDOW's mission statement in part reads, to protect, preserve, and manage wildlife for its aesthetic, scientific, educational, recreational, and economic benefit. And similarly, everything that I do as the fur bearer staff specialist and those field biologists that are involved with fur-bearing species management, we do what we do for the same reasons, to protect, preserve, and manage fur-bearing species, to ensure that fur-bearing species perpetuate well into the future. By using the biological data that came from our parts collection survey, as well as data from user questionnaires, we have presented to the Commission season recommendations that we feel best reflect those values to ensure sustainability and availability for all user groups. And with that, on the fur-bearing animal seasons, the Department proposes that beaver, mink, and muskrat seasons statewide run from October 1st to April 30th. Otter in Elko, Eureka, Humboldt, Lander, and Pershing counties run from October 1st through March 31st. Kit and red fox statewide October 1st through the last day of February. Gray fox season to run statewide from the last day in November to the last day of February. Bobcat season statewide from the last day in November to the last day of February. And both gray fox and bobcat seasons would be closed to non-residents. And then on page 13, the Commission will see that the proposed pelt sealing dates for bobcat pelts.
Questions from the Commission? Commissioner Wallace?
Yes, Russell, on bobcat season, you said the last day in November. Did you mean the last Saturday?
The last day of February. For the close?
No, on the opening.
The opening, last Saturday in November. I'm sorry.
Okay, additional questions? I got a fair amount of correspondence on this. As you can imagine, I think you've probably seen a fair amount of it. So a lot of that discussion centered around the population indicators that you use to identify your season lengths. And so if you could just walk us through how you get those ratios, who collects that data, particularly on bobcats, and what you're seeing that had led you to make the recommendation to lengthen the season out a little bit more this year from what it had been the previous two seasons.
Okay. Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, so there's several factors that we look at, but some of the primary ones that we utilize are kitten production. Those numbers are derived from what we call parts collection survey. Every bobcat that's sealed within the state, there's a mandatory, it's mandatory for them to turn over to the department the lower jaw from each animal, from which the fur-bearing biologists in the state, we get together, we process those jaws and take out a lower canine tooth out of the lower jaw. And from that, we can age them, classify them as juvenile, which is less than 12 months, or adult bobcats. And that's where the number comes from as far as the juvenile, the production. We compare that with the questionnaire data that comes in, the harvest report forms specifically for bobcats, which is also mandatory that they turn that in the time of sealing pelts. So we get 100% return rate for those questionnaires, or for that harvest report information data. And that gives us our production, our kitten to female ratio, which this year was 94 kittens per 100 females for the current year, which that compared to a 10-year average. Our 10-year average is 54 kittens per 100 females, and the long-term data, which our data set goes back now for 35 years, is 66 kittens per 100. So with 94 kittens per 100, we're quite a bit above that. Last year it was 66 kittens per 100, which is right at the long-term mean. The adult male to female ratio is also important. The reason why we look at that ratio is because the territory of a male bobcat is much larger than that of a female, which increases the probability of catching a male versus a female. You're more likely to encounter their territory. It's also important to look at that because with cat populations, because they're more catchable, when you start seeing that ratio get closer to a 1-to-1 ratio, that's an indication that you're taking too many bobcats out of the population, which means that in order to catch the same number of bobcats, they're catching more females. So that's a really important ratio as well for that reason. Our male to female ratios this year was 149 males per 100 females. And the 10-year average is 140 males to 100 females. And the long term, back to 35 years, is 141 to 100 females. So at 149, we're looking in pretty good shape there. And there's some other factors that we look at, but those are two of the very important ones that we look at. We also look at harvest effort, which is another one, and it was considerably lower than the long-term mean. So the reason why the department has recommended a slight increase, we're trying to move towards, in the past we've had a 2-tier system, a long season and a short season. And we're trying to move towards a 3-tiered system. So I went back and I looked at the data going back to 1976 on season lengths. And the average since 1976, excluding a couple of years where there were 20-day seasons, I felt like those were outliers, so I excluded those. But the long-term average season length has been 93 days. And so with our 3-tiered system, we thought that should be the standard season, the long-term average. So we went with right around the 95 days is what made sense on the calendar. And so that's our recommendation, is what we would consider a standard season. And then we'd have a shorter season on years when the statistics show us that we need to be more conservative with our harvest, and on years when the statistics show us that we can be more liberal, we'd have a liberal 120-day season to match what the season long has been over the last 15 years or so. So that's why we came to the 95-day season.
So a lot of the correspondence that I've received has advocated for going to the 120-day season, and it cites a multitude of reasons, but I'm just curious why the department hadn't recommended a 120-day season.
Well, looking at the 1 year's data, this past year's data, it would indicate that everything's doing fantastic. We had very limited participation last year, very limited harvest. It was about half of the long-term average for harvest. Our production's the 5th highest production we've ever recorded, and the effort was well below the long-term average, which is a good thing to have it below that. But we're coming out of a couple of years of reduced production. Last year it was 66, which is right at the average, which is good. But the previous year before that, it was quite low. And so with this 3-tiered system, I've started looking at it rather than on a 2-year basis. I started looking at it a 3-year because it kind of smooths out the bumps and trying to stabilize seasons. And the 3-year average does that. This is pretty standard biological practice. This is how the flyways operate. We look at a 3-year average because it helps keep you from going from extremes. You don't go from an extremely liberal season to an extremely restrictive season back to back. It kind of, or vice versa. You don't go from restrictive to liberal. It just kind of sort of smooths the road out rather than having huge swings is why I went with the 3-year. And on the 3-year, it put me at a standard season. And actually looking at it on a 2-year average, I also found that it would probably be operating off of this 3-tier system. It would also be in a standard season.
Additional questions? Seeing none, I know there's some county advisory boards with inputs on this. So county advisory board input on item 21, which is Commission Regulation 16-13, specific to fur bearer seasons, which is page 12 in our packet, as well as 13, so we'll keep the sealing dates included in our discussion.
Sean Shea, Washoe County. I just want to say we approved this on a 3-to-1 vote. There were some questions that the biologist there couldn't answer. Like we were gonna ask why it was just a random 95. We just didn't know either. So I want to say with a 3-to-1 vote that we approved it.
For the department's recommendation?
Oh, I'm sorry. For the November 1st start.
For the record, Paul Dixon, Clark Cab. We had a fairly lively discussion on this. We had a split vote, 4-2 of the members there, and because I couldn't defend the reasoning behind a 95 well, we ended up, the motion made and approved was for a 120-day season starting November 1st, because I didn't have the justification for why 95 was picked, and I wasn't able to get a hold of Russell due to my own conflicts, so I'll take some responsibility for having all the information in front of my board, but at this point in time, the recommendation of Clark is for 120 days. Season.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gil Yannick for the record, Carson Cab. Yeah, when we saw the data of the number of coming out of the surveys of the kittens and what's transpired previously, we just couldn't figure out why it was restricted back to 94 days and 120. It seemed like it was logical and was beneficial to the trappers. And so we voted on this and said that unless the department can come up with some real sufficient reasoning as to why you want to bring it to 120 days, 94 days rather than 120, they authorized me to either vote yes if you approve it, if you move it to 120 days, and vote no if you keep it at 94. Thank you.
Additional county advisory board inputs? Seeing none, we'll go to general comment, or public comment, on fur bearer seasons, and we'll start with Las Vegas.
No, we need to start with
Yes, Mr. Chair, Jana Wright for the record. Once again, on the discussion on fur-bearing animals, I never quite understand why there's no quotas or no limits set for these critters as there are for the birds and other animals that the department manages. On the bobcats, because they are sealed, we have excellent data. And it's unfortunate for these other animals that are trapped. Once again, I don't know how many beaver, mink, or muskrat were taken last year, and that causes me some concern. On the bobcat, if the department biologist has determined that 95 days is the best parameters for this season, I would think the commission would listen to their biologists. Excuse me. At the Clark County Cab, there was a lot of talk about a letter from the Nevada Trappers Association, which the members of the Cab had, but the public didn't. And what I took away from that was the author of the letter, John Sullivan, went on and on about how great the department was, except for this year, when they should really have a 120-day season. You can't have it both ways, in my opinion. So if you're going to approve anything, I would go with the 95 days by the department on the bobcats. Thank you.
Public comment in Las Vegas?
Yeah, I do.
Go ahead.
Chairman Drew, Commissioner members, for the record, my name is Julius Fortuna. I'm the Conservation Director, speaking on behalf of Nevada Firearms Coalition in the state chapter of the NRA. We represent 35,000 firearm owners and thousands of sportsmen and women in Nevada. I'd like to go on record to support the Nevada Trappers Association's request to move back to the 15-year historic 120-day-long season. Our recommendations are built on the following. With the fur cost down to about $250 per bobcat, which according to many of our trapping friends, it means it's almost not even worth going, there most certainly will be a resulting incremental reduction in the trapping participation, which could exasperate our harvest objectives in the midst of one of the best years on record. Number two, that leads into the second reason, which is the dramatically increased population of bobcats according to Nevada on-the-ground scientists. So the thought of a 94-day season really doesn't make sense when you look at the fact we're going back 30 years versus, let's look at the last 15 years, of which 12 were 120-day season. So we'd like to respectfully ask that the season for trappers go back to the 120 days based on the current Nevada science.
Okay.
Thank you.
Next public comment in Las Vegas?
Go ahead.
Mike Reese for Southern Nevada Coalition for Wildlife. We concur with Mr. Fortuna's comments there. We do realize that with the data that's been presented of 94 kittens, I kind of equate that to a fawn to doe ratio. I mean, we look at 40 fawns to 100 does, and that's norm. When I see 94 kittens to 100 females, that just tells me, man, if we could have that in our big game, we'd probably do away with the draw system. I know that Russell has done an extensive amount of research on this. I know that historically we're conservative across the board on all of our wildlife. I commend that. I have a hard time understanding why the norm for the last 10 to 12 years, like Julius has said, has been 120 days. I think that the trappers stepped forward and said when it drops below what our norm should be, we are inclined to go ahead and lower it. But then again, when it raises up, we should be able to see the results of that coming on up. We are all for a 120-day season as the norm, not as the exception. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, Stephanie Myers from Clark County. There is a humane revolution going on, which is an increased awareness of the role and importance of animals in the lives of humans. And companies and agencies, such as yours, are becoming more and more sensitive to public opinion. Take, for example, Ringling Brothers retiring their elephants. Take, for example, SeaWorld changing their policy on orcas. Take, for example, Walmart and McDonald's, which are shifting to cage-free eggs. Animals should not and are not articles of commerce, and yet leghold trapping makes commerce at taxpayers' expense, by the way, out of what trappers call recreation. And it doesn't matter whether a pelt sells for $100 or $1,000. Trapping is a commercial enterprise. Leghold trapping is animal cruelty. It's banned in many countries, as you know, in many states. And animal cruelty is wrong. Leghold trapping needs to be banned, especially in light of the non-target animals that are killed and injured, such as my own dog and many others. And especially in light of the almost total lack of regulation in the state of Nevada. So one good season out of, and especially when 3 years ago it was only 29%, it should not equate to adding an entire extra month of the bobcat season. And if you grant the trappers' demands of 120 days, you send a signal to everyone that Nevada doesn't care about animal cruelty, that the Nevada Department of Wildlife and the Commission condones animal cruelty. And I really invite you to please be part of the humane revolution. Thank you very much.
Okay, and that's everyone I can see in Las Vegas, but just in case, is there any other public comment?
No other public comment, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Public comment, Reno, on item 21, CR 1613, specific to fur bearer seasons.
Let's start at the front and then we'll move back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, Bob Bruner. I just want to ask that you use the 120-day season. It sounds to me that we went from 95 or from 120 to 95 because of range conditions 3 years ago. I think we need to use the latest data, which shows an outstanding production and the current field conditions that are on in the field right now. And that would be for a 120-day season. I would also like to ask that the commission not be swayed by everyone claiming to represent the entire general public. If you take a look at the size of the groups that these individuals are with, if compared to the general population, they are 0.00068% of the population. So they're not general public. They are a fringe element, as am I, a small subset of the general public. So I wouldn't want to claim the general public, and they should not be able to either. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, next public comment, Reno.
Yes, for the record, Fred Volz. A few comments about this subject. First, 1 year of high reproduction does not mean that that's sustainable long-term and should not be used as a base point for extending seasons. Next, trapper opportunity, convenience, and success are not the metrics we're supposed to be using in equitably managing and sustaining our wildlife. So I would advocate that we go back to the 83-day season, not even increasing it to 95. And finally, trappers' motives for profit should not and do not trump the welfare of the bobcat species or the public interest in protecting wildlife, not maximizing its exploitation. Thank you.
Elaine Carrick in Reno. I heard the comment that the bobcat population is considered healthy now. So why would a season be lengthened to kill more bobcats with the risk of making that population unstable? Why not leave the trapping season at 83 days to make sure that that population stays healthy? Second, the support material states that this past year there were 94 kittens born per 100 adult females. But there's no data that the survival rate, what the survival rate for the kittens is, and how does this past year survival rate for kittens compare to previous years? Also, what was the method for obtaining the information on the kittens per adult female? How large was the sample? What areas was this information obtained? If sound science is used to make decision regarding killing the public's wildlife, that information should be given to the public before lengthening a trapping season. Third, having a number like 95 kittens does not mean that the next season is going to produce that same number. There's always the possibility of drought conditions which will continue, and that would affect the bobcat production. 1 year does not make a trend. Fourth, bobcats are a great predator for rodents. With the current plague in the mountains and the campground at South Lake Tahoe was closed due to the plague, killing more bobcats does not seem logical if bobcats help to keep the rodents under control and prevent disease from spreading. Lastly, extending this bobcat season is not a management tool, nor does any science say that this should be done. Lengthening the season simply gives trappers more opportunity to make more money off the public's wildlife. With the current season of 83 days, trappers can kill as many bobcats as they want. The only part of that animal used is their fur, which is sold for big dollars to be used for fashion accessories, like an elephant's tusks are used to make trinkets. Is this really what the public's wildlife should be used for, to make more money? Does the bobcat season really need to be lengthened for this reason? Please do not extend this bobcat season. There's no science to back this up, and there's good science that points to using bobcats to keep rodent diseases from infecting people. Thank you.
Next public comment.
Yes, Karen Taylor, Washoe County resident. My comments were sent in a letter. I hope some of you were able to read that letter. I won't belabor them. I did send my comments in advance because about 4 years ago when we were talking about bobcats, I think that I felt like I ambushed some staff, and I feel bad about that still 4 years later. Some of my questions were answered by Russell. I am still concerned about the non-target data and who is responsible for that. And an increase in seasons will only increase the non-target data. I am concerned that we're not taking a look at that. And I would like to see the season kept as it is now, please, and without any extensions. Thank you.
Okay, next public comment.
That's it in Reno, Mr. Chairman.
We have one more.
I'm
Do
sorry.
one more in the back.
No, not me.
Bobby McCollum in Reno. I also want to make a comment about the season being lengthened. NDAL's May 31st memorandum includes the following statement as justification for the increase. Bobcat data from the previous year's sample and data collection indicates statewide populations of bobcat are healthy in Nevada. The term healthy is not defined. Regarding the kitten production, did an NDAL biologist conduct field observations to come up with some of these numbers? And why wasn't any kind of report available for the public view? Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else in Reno?
No, that's it in Reno, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Public comment in Elko. Come on up.
Rex Flower speaking for myself. I would hope you would support the Trappers Association in the 120-day season. It's not about trapping for 120 days, but about affording those that live up here in the northeastern part of the state to be able to get in the field before the heavy snows come. Those in the western part of the state to be able to go out and trap after the chucker season is over with. As you know, a lot of trappers don't want to trap while the hunters are out hunting chuckers because of their dogs and stuff. So it's, yeah, well, it does seem like it affords more opportunity. People aren't going to trap a third of the year. Most trappers are going to be trapping in that 30-day range. So it affords them the opportunity to pick the time to go. Thank you.
Okay. Next public comment in Elko. Joel, come on up. I know you had one.
Do I get 6 minutes, Mr. Chairman?
I'm assuming you're representing NTA?
I am.
Yes.
Joe Blakesley, Nevada Trappers Association. I'm going to have to talk fast because I could talk for hours on this. This is probably the 40th year that I've stood in front of this board on this exact subject. It's been bantered around for all that time. I'm going to go into a little bit of history so you understand exactly why we even manage bobcats. It really doesn't have that much to do with bobcats. The reason it started was in the mid-'70s when they had an international conference and they outlawed the international trade of spotted cats all around the world. Leopards, ocelots, jaguars, cheetahs. So the federal government said, well, that's going to create a market for bobcats because the other animals aren't going to be on the market. So 40 years ago, the feds told the states that they wanted them to look at bobcat populations and bobcat management. We tried the population estimates, we tried quotas, we tried a couple of things. It ended up with an act of Congress saying that you didn't have to do those things. You could manage on trend information. So I would say in the last 40 years we found out that that ban on spotted cats around the world hasn't impacted bobcats or Canadian lynx. That's why this started. It had nothing to do with really managing the populations of bobcats. But intuitively, because we started, we think that's why we're doing it. I don't believe that we have any effect on bobcat populations at all. I've been watching this for 40 years. When the thing about the protocols that Russell's talking about, and I support the protocols, but I don't think we're there yet. The problems with the averages are we floundered around for the first 20 years. We had 3-week seasons. We had 2-week seasons. We had different seasons in southern Nevada than we had in northern Nevada. So that's the history behind it. The fact is, in the last 16, 17 years, 120 days has been the normal season. 4 years ago, when the data indicated that we might want to look at a shorter season, we agreed to that based on the 2-tier system. Now we've got 2 years where we've got excellent trend information. We think it's fair that we raise it on the same basis that we lowered it. We've got a ways to go on this tiered system. Russell's put a tremendous amount of thought and effort and time into that. I appreciate it, but we have a few issues that we'd like to iron out before we go to that protocol, which this commission hasn't approved yet. Just to back up my thought that we don't have to spend that much time worrying about bobcats, if you look at the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, we not only had fur trappers, but the government trappers targeted them as a predator. They used to kill 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 bobcats a year for the government. Then we had the fur trappers on top of that. And they also poisoned them. I mean, it's quite conceivable that we were killing 10 times as many bobcats in those years as we did last year. Would we get 1,100 or something? I mean, it's minuscule compared to the historical history. Let's see, what else have I got here? There's a good story, some of you may have heard about it before, about the guy that was watching his wife make dinner one night, and she had a roast, and she cut the ends off the roast and threw them away. And he said, "Honey, why are you doing it that way?" And she says, "Because my mother did it that way." So he saw Mom the next time, and he says, "How come you cut the ends off the roast?" And she says, "Because my mother did it that way." So Thanksgiving, he saw Grandma, and he says, "How come you cut the ends off the roast?" She says, "So that I could fit it in my pan." What we're doing is trying to fit bobcat management into a pan. And right now we've got enough room for 2 roasts. We really do. So, I mean, you're going to hear a lot of arguments. The first time I met Don Moldy was in 1977. He said that if we continued the harvest of bobcats at the rate that we were harvesting them, that they would be extinct in 3 years. Well, we went on to harvest 2-3 times as many as that for decades, and they have never gone extinct. I don't believe there's one bit of scientific evidence that we've ever had a negative effect on bobcat populations. And we've done everything from no seasons whatsoever for decades and decades to 2-week seasons to, I mean, we've cut the ends off the roast and we've made it this big and we've made it this big, and bobcats are kind of like coyotes. They're going to do what they're going to do regardless of what we do. So I would ask you to go with our recommendation of November 1 to the end of February for both bobcats and gray fox. That solves the problem with the gray fox. And the last thing I'd like to mention is I believe the majority of the cabs went along with our recommendation. So thank you.
Okay. Additional public comment in Elko?
For the record, Henry Krinka, speaking for myself, I'd just like to say that I support Joe Blakely and the Trappers Association. Thank you.
Okay. Come on up.
For the record, Lance Titzel, representing myself. As a Northern Nevada trapper, the last year of the season, or the weather really affected us in this area in general, where we weren't able to get out but for 2-3 weeks of the season. So as previously said, the data may be skewed as well. There's probably even more healthier bobcat population than there is now. Giving us a November season will allow us to get out there before the big snows hit again. So, thank you.
Next public comment in Elko. See one more. Come on up. Any others? Yep. Don, come on up, and then we'll take you.
Mr. Chairman, Don Mulderino, speaking on behalf of the Nevada Wildlife Alliance. I'm passing out some information I've sent to you before. I don't know if any of you ever looked at it. On the one page, the colorful page, is the annual Excel spreadsheet that the department enters its tooth data on. And on the non-colorful page, which is the one I'd like to talk about for a minute, this is trend data. By the way, these numbers are not mine. These are department numbers. I went through and pulled them all out. They all came off these colorful sheets, so I didn't invent anything here. And what this is, the black and white side, is trend data, which the department uses all the time for everything. It's nothing new, trend data. This is trend data from 1980 until last year. And it has a couple of things having to do with kittens. You've heard the kitten per 100 female number, and later, if anybody's interested, I can explain where that number comes from. But if you look, and I put averages every 10 years for the first 2 decades, and then an average after the last 15 years. And if you look at the third column in, kittens as a percent of adult females, you'll see that the first decade, 80 to 90, the percent was 80%, average for the first 10 years. The next 10 dropped to 71%. And the last 15 years, minus a couple of years, or minus 1 year, no, I guess I have it all. The last 15 years, that number is now down to an average of 53%. The biology of the animal says that number should be approximately 100. The last 15 years, 53%. The other item I've put on here is a similar measure as kittens as a percent of the total sample. That's the second column in from the right. It's a little bit the same, but slightly different. What that column reflects is that under ideal conditions or biological conditions that you would expect, that number should be 30%. Kittens should be 30% of a total trap sample. And as you can see, first decade, we averaged 25%. Next decade, that dropped to 22%. The last 15 years, it's down to 18%. So this is your information. These are your numbers. This is trend data for 35 years. And I suggest that gives us a reason to understand why the department might be concerned about not taking one good year out of 36 as a blip on the screen and claiming that everything is wonderful. The other thing I'd like to comment about is the department for years has used the adult male to adult female ratio to trump every other ratio that doesn't look good, including low kitten production. It's unrelated. That's roughly the same as saying that in Area 10 out here, we've got 10 fawns per 100 does. Somebody says, oh my God, we need more fawns, that's bad. But then somebody would say, well, no, we have 35 bucks per 100 adult females. That's exactly what we expect. That's what we manage for. And therefore, that trumps the 10 fawns per 100 does. That is essentially the equivalent of what the department has presented you with respect to that ratio. Around the West, that male to female ratio is always in favor of males. It's normal. It's natural. There is nothing predictable about it with respect to juvenile production. So I think that I agree with Mr. Blakesley, by the way, that I think bobcat management does need some revision in this state, and I've thought that for more than 35 years. I've been distressed that we haven't seen that, and I think the bobcat has gotten shortchanged over the years, and really, I think based on these trend numbers, which are your numbers, they're not my numbers, it seems to me anybody would be hard-pressed to say that there may not be something here that we should look at. Thank you.
I know we had at least one more public comment. Anyone else? If there is, come on up and we'll get it taken care of right now. Okay.
For the record, I'm Jason James. I'm here for myself. And, I know there's a lot more people that's concerned about this issue that's not here because I have a personal page, or not personal, but a Facebook page helping to share all this information. But what I think is always interesting is the fact that, you know, it's all about the money, the money, the money, but there's also other aspects about trapping these animals that people don't realize. Actually, the truth of the matter is bobcats taste delicious. You know, that's something that most people don't hear about, but it's the truth. You know, and this Miss Myers is always talking about California this, and it's not a lake hold trap. That's one thing that needs to get out there. It's no longer a leg hold trap. 98% of the trappers out there do not want a leg hold catch. If you catch a leg hold catch, it's just not what they're after. They want a foothold catch. And, you know, it's talking about recreation. It's all about recreation. These people out there killing for recreation. There's more to it than a recreational aspect. I personally and my family trap on a daily basis. We're out there trapping gophers, ground squirrels, everything else too, to try to help stop the plague and stuff. Right now, Nevada is sitting in the middle of a storm, so to speak. We have the plague in 4 states around us right now. And this was mentioned earlier by them guys about the plague, but, you know, the bobcats carry plague too. You know, they carry the fleet. You know, a few years back, there was a guy in Arizona that got plague, a trapper from bobcats. So it's important to manage the bobcats for disease too. They can carry all the different disease. Another aspect that, you know, has never been thought of or mentioned that I've heard, I've only been speaking publicly like this for a couple of years, but the fox season coincides some years, like if it's a 120-day season, it coincides with the bobcat season at the same time. And what this does is it, in reality, from my own observation, is it relieves pressure from Indow. Because if there's guys, there's the legitimate trappers that you hear talk all the time, but there's also those guys that fly by night trappers that go out there and do things just under the radar. Well, they go out there when the seasons are shorter and say that they're trapping foxes, and in reality, they're trapping bobcats. And us legal trappers don't want to see that. So it helps relieve some of this stuff if we keep that season date the same. You know, it's something that, like I said, these are my personal issues. It has nothing to do with any other agency or anything.
You're at 3 minutes, so if you can
Okay.
finish up.
And I'll just wrap it up with that stuff because, you know, it's a few thoughts that I haven't heard mentioned before, but thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Any other input from the public in Elko? Okay. I'll bring it back to the commission. I'm going to ask Commissioner Wallace. I know the purging. I'm sorry.
Hi, this is Las Vegas. Hi, this is Las Vegas. We have a new member of the general public that just came in. Can she speak?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry I was a little bit delayed in getting here, and I haven't been able to hear all the previous conversation. This is Karen Lane. But I just want to say that I don't agree with the longer season, but I think in some respects it may be a moot point because I think what you're beginning to see, if you look at what's happening at the Fallon fur sales, is that the economics of the bobcat fur sales are starting to catch up. I see this, or catch up with what's going on. In other words, it seems to me that in the past there's been a much higher, if you talk about the demand and supply curve, there has always been more demand than there has been supply. But what you're starting to see in these last several years, last year only 23% of the pelts were sold. They were a higher sales rate. There were 1,122 pelts offered for sale. The price was down from the previous year. This year, only 932 pelts were offered for sale. Only 80% of those pelts were sold. And the complaint that I heard at the CAB meeting is that at an average price of $215, that it's much harder for the trappers to get out there and make money off these pelts. Well, I would suggest to the commission that the commission has got to start looking at the economics of this particular situation in terms of looking at how long the season would be. And I would think that most of the trappers and the Nevada Trappers Association may want to rethink this issue as well, simply because if you continue this process, and I think if you look at most of the people who demand these pelts, they're in China and Russia. And what we're seeing right now is that a world economy, or those economies, are not doing well. And with the exit from the EU that we've seen, I think the situation is going to get dramatically worse as opposed to better. So it seems. So I would say this to the commission, that we need to, I do agree that we need to look at other issues. I think climate change, where you're seeing February temperatures in southern Nevada of 70 and 80 degrees during February, these issues should be taken a look at, and we really need to think how we're doing this season setting. Thank you.
Okay. Well,
Thank you, Chairman.
Anyone else new?
No, thank you, Chairman.
Last call in Elko. Okay. Seeing none, I'll bring it back. I did mention that Joe Krim with Pershing Cab had to leave, but he did ask that we report his cab notes. So I'm going to ask Vice Chair Wallace to please do that for us.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. His notes are for item number 21. Support all we support all with the exception that we want the trapping season to go to 120 days.
So that was Pershing Cab. I did look, I think, at all the cabs that met. The three cabs that spoke earlier, Washoe, Clark, Carson City, I think had alternate recommendations, but unless I missed something or it got missed on the sheet, I think most of the other cabs that were reported were along with the department recommendations. Can someone correct me on that? Elko was? Douglas was? Of the cabs in the room, and I misspoken in any of that?
Not the cabs in the room.
Who am I missing, Joel? Who was the other one?
There was Carson, Washoe, Churchill, White Pine, Clark, Lyon, and Mineral. Seems like one more. Pershing.
I know Pershing was. I thought Lyon, do you remember Commissioner Johnston? I thought their action report was supporting Endow, but.
We had guys there.
Okay. They aren't here to answer that question, so one more plug for showing up to the meetings, I guess. But just to discuss that. Okay, commission questions or comments? Commissioner Valentine?
Chairman Drews, is it possible, I know we're looking at two-year seasons, trapping season. Is it possible to split that apart and relook at harvest numbers and biological data to set the seasons next year?
Russell, I'll ask you for this, but I'll take a stab at it. I believe we do have the authority, if we wanted to, on the off year to make an amendment to the seasons. I think we've certainly done that in the past. I don't know about on fur-bearing seasons, but I know in other cases we have done that, certainly in the case of big game.
Russell Wilson, for the record. That's correct, Commissioner Drew, Chairman Drew. We can come back in next year. We can reevaluate the data, and we can make an amendment to this 2-year cycle.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay. Additional inputs? Commissioner McNinch?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had this conversation with a couple of folks, and it never did get resolved. But I vaguely recall when I came back on the commission at a meeting in Fallon. We were discussing the trapping seasons, and there was conversation about modifying how the populations are estimated and evaluated, things of that nature. And that the department was in the process of beginning that new way of doing things. That's been a few years now, and it sounds like there might be something moving forward at this point, from what I hear. But I think if that's in fact what's going to happen, I'm real curious to see what that is. I'm getting to the point where I need to see it. I need to see if there's another way of doing this, because it's we're in the same conversation, and if there's not a better way, I need somebody to tell me that. If there are better ways of evaluating, then it'd be nice to hear what those are, what's being considered, what's not working, so that we all can have a better feel for it. And it doesn't help today necessarily, except that it might put me in a place where I'm a little less willing to give from the standpoint of seasons. I want to know a little bit more about it. I mean, I heard it a long time ago. I'm getting to the point where I just need to see it. I know it's difficult to count. You can't do counts with helicopters. I get that. I just see it as I'm just looking forward to a different conversation at this point. So, I'm leery of the 120 days, especially hearing the department's thoughts on the proposed alternative way of tiering this. But I guess that's just where I stand for now.
Okay. Additional thoughts, comments, Commissioner Johnston?
Thank you, Chairman Drew. Some of the comments we received, letter from Mountain Lion Foundation, I believe it was also from Project Coyote. There was 2 signatures on the letter we received, but it was on the Mountain Lion Foundation letterhead. The letter just concluded, please end trapping for anything other than rescue and rehabilitation. So that type of comment, I appreciate. They want to provide their point of view, but that's really not about a trapping season. That's just an objection to trapping in general, and that was what their letter was addressed at. And then some of the other comments we've heard today is geared more towards that than the actual season. And it's always dangerous when I start trying to do math. But I look at this from some of the numbers. And so if I look at the numbers from 2015, 2016, there's 186,157 total trap days. And that resulted in 1,132 bobcats being trapped. So it's 164 trap days for every 1 bobcat. If you start grasping at 25 additional days on the season, my math is right, and all the trappers hunt all of those additional days, it's another 6,950 trap days. And if you extrapolate about a success rate of the same as the data, it's perhaps maybe 42 additional bobcats. So we're sitting here arguing over 25 days and what appears to be potentially 42 bobcats if every trapper traps all of those additional days. It seems to me we could go along with the Cabs and the Trappers Association and have the 120-day season. And if we're going to start departing from that 120-day season, then maybe we'd look at it more closely in the future as this tiered process comes forward. And like I said, when I start doing math, it can get a little scary, but I think I'm okay when it comes to simple addition and division and multiplication. So when I get down to that, and that's roughly 4% of last year's harvest, an additional 30 days or 25 days is being requested, seems to be acceptable.
Okay. Additional inputs? Commissioner Moran?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I may look at this a little differently than most, but I kind of like the department's theory on smoothing out the bumps in the road, because I know in my lifetime I've seen the bobcat population fluctuate 3 times to the point where you see no trappers And I'm kind of, I don't have the scientific explanation for a lot of this stuff, but I do know that if there are no cats out there, you're not going to see any trappers. And so when it finally turns around and there are lots of cats out there, you're going to see lots of trappers. And so I think I'm kind of inclined to support the department's recommendation. It's kind of a middle of the road deal there where we have people wanting to stay for the public comment, wanting to stay with the 83-day, others wanting to go to the 120-day. I think I'm going to fall with the department on this one.
Okay. Additional inputs, Commissioner Young?
I said earlier that I always agreed with Commissioner Morai, and I'll tell you why in this particular case I'm going to support that same idea is that the rancher knows the ground and the surroundings around him better than anybody. I think better than a biologist that goes out in the field and actually studies it, no offense to you, to trappers that are out there trapping a few days a year. I've been around a lot of ranchers, and they know what's happening around them, and they know wildlife like it's instinctive to them because it's the way they make their living. They see and smell things and feel things that others don't. It's it's almost a zen, but they live out there. So for that reason, I support the middle of the road increase to 95 as well.
Okay. Additional inputs? Commissioner Bliss?
Thanks, Chairman Drew. I appreciate every angle that everyone looked at this, and every side has a valid point. Well, most sides have a valid point, I should say. I reach out to some old local trappers, and these guys have been trapping 50, 60 years, a couple of them, and so I bounce a lot of this stuff off of those folks. And these folks would trap if bobcats were worth $10 or if they were worth $1,000. They do it because it's what they've done their whole life. And I run these seasons by a couple of these guys, and their take on it was they felt that the later November cats were more prime, or getting into a little better fur quality than the early November cats. And I've had discussions with Joel about this and everybody else, and they don't believe that. So I also talked to some fur buyers about it, and they were in agreement as well that the later cats are better quality cats. And then I've been around down Las Vegas, the southern part of the state during that time of the year, but personally I don't know how a bobcat or any animal coming in the very early part of November is all that prime when it's still really warm down there. But I can't really speak on that part too much because I haven't been down there and seen those cats. It's just my thoughts on that. Now, as far as Russell's view on this and trying to balance this out and these bumps, I've said it in on lots of our items is I'm not a knee-jerk reaction type of person. I'm more of a baby steps approach at things because what you can do in 1 year, and I don't care if you're talking about bobcats or mule deer or antelope or anything, what you can do in 1 year in removal sometimes can take multiple years to recover it. And so I like the approach where it's going to try to balance that out and go over a 3-year type period. And it's tough for me. I enjoy trapping. Myself, I got family members that's trapped for years and years, done it for a living. And you also hear the argument, well, if you don't want to trap the first part of November, don't do it. Season opens November 1st. If you don't want to trap, don't do it. Stay home. Problem is, some guys do, but a lot of guys won't, because if they don't go set traps, someone else is going to set a trap in their spot. So it forces some of these guys to go set those traps. A couple other old guys that have passed away that were phenomenal sportsmen and won Fur Handle of the Year award several times, and Joel knows them, Mark Galley and Tommy Thomas from there in Eureka. I looked up to those guys a lot. I spent a lot of time in Art's living room talking about this stuff, because if I could be half the sportsman that guy was, I would feel really good about myself. Art would never, and Tommy would never go set a trap until after the first couple freezes. And no matter what anybody else was doing, that's just what they did, because they always said that they felt if they were going to harvest a cat, they'd want to do it when that cat it was only fair to the cat to do it when it was prime and they got the most out of that cat. And they didn't want to remove it for lesser money than what they could if they just waited another 3 weeks or a month. So I think, with all that being said, I'm more along the lines with the department's recommendations on this. I really am.
Okay. Additional inputs? Commissioner Wallace?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too feel like I'm falling in line with supporting the department in this, and after listening to a few of the commissioners speak, that's kind of where I'm at.
Okay. Just to clarify something from my standpoint, did I miss anyone? Does anyone have anything else? Okay, per the action reports that I just pulled, the cabs that I saw that supported the department's recommendations were Lincoln on a 4-1 vote. Elko was the department's recommendation, I believe. Eureka was the department's recommendation per the action report that I saw. And Douglas was the department's recommendation. And Churchill and Lyon was November 1st, along with the others that presented today. So just so we've got that discussion out there. I'm a little bit split on this. Normally, with the exception of maybe ram tags and the muddies, I'm pretty conservative when thinking about seasons and tags, and I think what the department has done is a pretty conservative recommendation based on the trends and them only being 1 year. I hear the advantage. One of the big arguments that I saw in the correspondence that we got for going to the 120-day season was the ability for people in the northeast part of the state to get out and trap before the weather set in, and it provides the later part of the season for Clark County folks. But with the exception of Mr. Stitzel and Mr. James, who came today, I didn't see that coming through the Elko cabs or the Eureka cabs or the correspondence that I received from people in those areas. So I don't know how much stock I necessarily put in that. And on the other side, I think what Commissioner Johnston said it is really true, that I don't think there's going to be a significant biological effect of going to a 120-day season. What past Commissioner Lane said is it's probably going to be more economics driven is probably accurate. I have a personal issue with building that into how we discuss it, but I think the participation is going to be driven by things like weather and economics more than it is by dates. And so I really don't have a strong druther one way or the other. That probably doesn't help anyone, but I just wanted to kind of document where I was at before we take a vote. So with that, unless there's any further discussion, I would entertain a motion. Commissioner Valentine.
Thank you, Chairman Drew. And that kind of brings up one of the reasons that I was wondering if we could just react to 1 year versus 2 years in moving forward. I tend to agree with going a little bit conservative and going with the department's recommendation, but at the same time keeping it a little bit open for any adjustments we need to do in 2017-18. That's my comment.
I guess in that regards, my only comment would be I think the cleanest way to do that would be to adopt this for the biennium with instruction to the department, maybe to come back and give us a recommendation next year, or at least have a discussion or an update on where we are, if they feel an alternate recommendation is warranted at that time. I think that probably makes the most sense. Just my thoughts. Okay. Further discussion? Okay, seeing none, I would entertain a motion. Not all at once.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion that we adopt CR 16-13 relevant to fur-bearing animals and bobcat sealing dates as proposed by the department.
Second.
So I have a motion by Commissioner McNinch and a second by Commissioner Morai to support Department of Wildlife's fur-bearing recommendations per CR 16-13 as presented today. So gray fox and bobcat seasons would remain as the last Saturday in November through the last day of February. Mr. Valentine, or before I get off on that, is there any question or discussion on that motion?
I'd make a comment.
Commissioner Johnston?
I think I get a sense from the comments I heard this motion is going to pass. Well, I would have, as I stated, I would have entertained and supported the season starting November 1, just based on what I've heard from here today, division among the cabs and that. But with that being said, I am going to support the motion because I am going to vote in favor of the season. I don't want to vote against the seasons, so I'll vote for them, although I would have been prepared to go in November 1.
I think I'm in the same boat, and the only thing that I would add, and I don't know that we need to do it as part of the motion, but I would ask, or at least indicate to the department some direction that we would like to get an update on this next year, and if we see a similar upward trend and we think that it may warrant a longer season next year, that we have that discussion as a potential amendment. Okay, I don't think we need that as a motion, unless Commissioner Valentine, you wanted to incorporate it. But
Well, Commissioner McNinch, would you incorporate that as a caveat in the?
Sure. I mean, I don't have a problem with incorporating that. It kind of stands in my mind as standard protocol to begin with. So to put it in there is not a problem.
Okay, Commissioner Morai, you're all right with that? Okay, Jordan, we are comfortable on that motion? All right, any further question or discussion? Commissioner Bliss.
My question, Chairman Drew, is in the motion, it includes the bobcat pelt sealing dates. Is
Correct.
that, unless I missed something, which could happen today, have we discussed that portion enough to have that in the motion?
There certainly hasn't been any discussion. I just want to verify that with the motion maker that it was implied that adopting the fur-bearing regulations did include page 13, bobcat pelt sealing dates.
I specifically stated it, and the reason why I didn't hesitate to do that was I hadn't heard any concerns. So, So I was fine with it. If there's conversation, then we can certainly have it. But yeah, I did include that.
So just to be clear, the motion is pertinent to everything on page 12 and 13 of our packet in regards to 1603. So that's seasons, open areas and season dates for beaver, mink, muskrat, otter, kitten, red fox, gray fox, bobcat, as well as the bobcat sealing dates. And I as well, I didn't see anything coming through county advisory boards or hear anything in public comment that suggested there was a concern with those sealing dates. I'm not seeing anyone jumping up and down, so.
As long as we're okay, I just wanted to make sure that we're okay.
Okay. Appreciate that. Anything else? Everyone's clear on the motion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries 8-0. And I believe that takes us to the end of item 21.